The Ro 57 was designed in 1938 and the prototype was ready at the beginning of 1939. It was a low-wing monoplane, a single-seater twin-engine fighter with an all-metal structure. The wing was made of light alloy with aileron, flaps covered in fabric. The fuselage was made of a structure in welded steel tubes covered with sheets of collaborating aluminum. The cockpit was closed by a glass hood that opened by sliding backwards. The tailplanes, also metal, had only the immobile surfaces covered in fabric. The landing gear had the two main retractable elements in the engine nacelles and a steerable tailwheel that was fed but not retractable. The engines were two 840 horsepower Fiat A74 radials with a recovery altitude of 3,800 m that powered three-bladed metal propellers with variable pitch in flight. One rotated clockwise and the other counterclockwise, thus ensuring a balanced interaction with the horizontal tailplanes that saw their action strengthened. For the flow, identified by point 1 in the triptych of the aircraft shown on the screen for one of the engines, I said the flow of air energized by the action of the propellers that went to act on the horizontal tailplanes, with notable increases in the gradients of rolling moment, which could be easily exploited for the purpose of maneuvers, as noted by various pilots of the Regia Aeronautica who tested the aircraft in Guidonia. The yawing moments on the vertical empennage were completely analogous, given the counter-rotation of the engines. In practice, the reaction torques had all been either neutralized or appropriately subservient to the reactivity in maneuvers, given the intended use of the airplane as a fighter. Also very interesting was the large increase in lift achieved on the portion of the wing affected by the downstream flow of the propellers and the large contribution to the stall delay that was thus obtained, so much so that the Ro 57 was able to attack rapidly ascending slopes that were unimaginable for a contemporary single-rotor fighter. A very interesting study, which was conducted on various models by Galasso both when he was in Turin, in the design of other aircraft, and on preliminary studies of the Ro 57 conducted in the wind tunnel in Naples, in various regimes and arrangements, and which is at such a level that both in Italy and abroad I have been able to see studies of the same level of depth only starting from 1941, an elaborate study that, for example, in the project of the British Westland Whirlwind it is preferred not to put into practice. In this last aircraft the horizontal tail planes were in fact in a raised position precisely to avoid massive interactions with the vortices produced by the propulsion systems, and to ensure the most undisturbed behavior of the tail surfaces. The armament in the prototype configuration consisted of two 12.7 mm Breda Safat machine guns fixed in the upper part of the bow. The prototype was piloted by Aldo Ligabue. It was tested in flight at Capodichino at the beginning of 1939 and showed brilliant qualities of climbing speed. Handling. Arturo Ferrara, a close collaborator of the engineer Galasso, said that the aircraft was transferred to Guidonia and subjected to a dive test by Captain Erciele Occolani, who tried it in a dive between 600 and 700 km per hour, and a break in the engine cowling was recorded without this, however, causing any inconvenience, and a normal landing was achieved. The inconvenience that had led to the break in the cowling was immediately identified and eliminated without further problems. Engineer Giovanni Galasso wrote a small note in June 1940 including the final judgment of the Superior Management Studies Experimental Center of Guidonia. The Ro 57 prototype, designed in 1938, presented in Guidonia as a fighter, began official tests at the beginning of November 1939. Tests for various characteristics tests started on April 1, 1940 by military pilots continued uninterrupted until June 1940, at which time the characteristics obtained were communicated and that were improved compared to those obtained by the test pilot in the first flights. In the Campania, final judgment was also received in which it was said that the vehicle was of good quality with excellent flight characteristics, piloting, handling, but an increase in speed was recommended, an increase in armament and an improvement in the cooling of the engines was required, particularly of the lubrication oil, a decrease in the lowering of the ailerons when it was necessary to open the flaps to have greater efficiency, and lightness of the transverse control in takeoff operations. This latter simply due to an oversight of the dynamic balance before the first flight in Guidonia, and which was not in fact detected in the subsequent ones. An attempt was made immediately to overcome these problems. and an improvement in the oil temperatures was obtained by lowering them by 6 degrees and a revision of the ailerons, but above all an attempt was made to obtain the strengthening of the armament by replacing the Breda Safat with German 20mm Ikaria mg FF cannons, but the Germans, who used it for their most important fighters and who had no surplus production, did not want to release a quantity of weapons compatible with the series production of the Ro 57, even though they gave the possibility of purchasing the construction license for this armament. A quick evaluation of the timing for the start of licensed production, with tooling adjustments and personnel training, demonstrated that these armaments would be available too far in the future, taking into account that this type of cannon was the only one usable due to its lightness and that its shape allowed to save a large part of the reciprocal centering of the aircraft, as well as its recoil did not put inertia forces at play very different from those of the machine guns already used, and that even their positioning, considering the ammunition tanks and their weight and center of gravity, was easily manageable in the project without causing serious changes and loss of time. No alternative solution was seen. I was talking about the weight of this cannon, only 26.3 kilograms, compared to the weight of a 12.7 Breda Safat, which was equal to 29 kilograms. I was talking about the fact that it could easily be used to replace the machine guns, the front part of the fuselage being shaped in such a way as to be able to easily contain the magazines of the two cannons in addition to the same in place of the Breda Safat, and considering the position of the relative belts and containers of the same, engineer Galasso was instead strongly opposed to the advice of Colonel Torre of the DSSE to equip the aircraft with a rear defense weapon, because he considered it an unnecessary increase in weight, with consequent deterioration in the aircraft's performance. Another fact that cannot be ignored is the strong interference of Breda Aviation that insisted with the authorities of the Ministry of Aeronautics in affirming that the Breda 88 could also cover the role of heavy fighter with long range. That is the specific role that was thought for the Ro 57, because soon the problems that afflicted the BA 88 would be solved. Regarding the line of conduct on the armament and the difficulties that the IMAM aircraft was encountering, it must be taken into account how the engineer Galasso advocated the Ro 57 both for the fact that the Breda Safat with which it was currently armed could act without the limitation of having to shoot through the propeller disc and therefore at full maximum rate of fire, that is 700 rounds per minute each instead of 570, as happened in the case of having to synchronize the weapon with the motion of the propeller, and with the possibility of replacing them with the much more powerful Ikaria cannon, as soon as this had been available in a significant number of units. These considerations were not far-fetched, and above all they would have been correct given that already in mid-1941 the Ikaria cannon became secondary armament for the supply of the Luftwaffe, being replaced by the new milligram 151 always 20mm. In the process of aerodynamic improvement of the aircraft, it should also be noted that the engineer Galasso had planned the elimination of the tailplane braces, identified with 3 in the triptych that you can see, braces that would have been replaced by means of a different internal structural arrangement of the tailplanes, with a new distribution of the stress on appropriately added or stiffened structural elements. This would have led the Ro 57 to increase the maximum speed from 515 km/h to 533 km/h. Galasso had also studied for the tailplanes 2 other plants that would exploit even better the effects of the vortices arriving from the propellers. As for the fuselage section, identified with point 2 in the triptych shown on the screen, its geometry had emerged from the wind tunnel and structural tests as the best from both a structural and aerodynamic point of view. In particular, it minimized the destructive interactions between propeller flowing on the fuselage and interaction with the wing fuselage connections. Furthermore, the moments generated by the fire of the weapons were better absorbed with a reduction in vibrations, fast and without couplings or resonances. Furthermore, regarding the maximum speeds of the twin-engine aircraft, tests were being carried out on fuel with higher octane numbers than the A-74s, which led to the certain prediction of being able to have greater power from the same engine during 1941, with an increase in the maximum speed of the aircraft to 560 to 570 km/h, therefore extremely close to that of its direct competitor, the Westland Whirlwind, which with linear engines and therefore lower form resistance was able to fly at a Maximum speed of 575 km per hour.